And he said to Jenny Cruz-Williams, before John Robbie comes on, I want to tell him something. I said, what? He says, I want to tell him something. You're not allowed to say, well, I'm not saying what it is. I want to speak to John Robbie when you hand it over. And I begin to think, oh my goodness, what have I done?
John Robbie, welcome to Greystones. How are you?
I'm very, very well and very, very honoured to be on this recording. Great to chat to you, Jeremy, and hi to anyone who remembers the old fossil living in Johannesburg.
John, absolutely thrilled to have you on. Can't believe it. It's fantastic. It's a real good showing of how far the podcast has come from the beginning days and the interest everybody has in Greystones Rugby Club. So to finish off season 2 with you is a real special day. John, my research for your episode came through this Golden Jubilee hardback that was produced in 1987. But I think it might have been better off been renamed the John Robbie Compendium. You're mentioned in nearly every paragraph, and when you look at your career, John, it's easy to see why. Leinster School's Senior Cup winner, captain of Trinity College, captain of Cambridge University, captain of Greystones, captain of Leinster, Irish international, a Lion, captain of Transvaal, South African international, talk show radio host who's rubbed shoulders with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. John, where am I going to start?
well, first of all, the older I get, whether it's my rugby career or my radio career, the better I seem to get. Because let me just bring you down to earth. Remember that I played 9 games for Ireland and lost all 9. So I have the most consistent record. But it's amazing as you get older, it doesn't seem to matter. And for a guy who was never very big or strong, wasn't particularly fast, I mean, I look back on the most amazing career. And the other thing that's funny is that book you mentioned, and I'm looking at a copy of it in my bar because it's a wonderful record of Greystones. And I remember they had the dinner and Shawnee Fitzpatrick, the late Shawnee Fitzpatrick, a man who was obviously very controversial, but he flew me over for the dinner. Wow. And I remember I was still playing rugby in South Africa, and there we were, all these young rugby players, and they were the old captains. And I was looking back at all these old grey-haired guys and thinking, my goodness, they're the past of, and now I'm one of them. So time has passed very, very quickly, but it's the memories never go, and it's great to be talking about them, Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think if we start, like, you'd leave school with a Senior Cup medal, the high school, only time in the history that they did it, and you'd get 3rd level education, Trinity College. You were the youngest captain, I understand, that Trinity College ever had. 1976, you won the Leinster Senior Cup, which was a really big deal in those days. But funnily enough, alongside you in that team was a future Greystones legend, Pierce Power. Do you have any memories playing with Pierce up at Trinity?
Pierce was a terrific player, really was a very good player. And for some reason, didn't get noticed. I mean, I can remember playing for Leinster, and John Power of Bective got selected on the flank. And I remember saying to John on the way to the game, congratulations on getting picked for Leinster. And I remember him saying to me, I feel great about it, but I also feel bad because Pierce Power should have been selected ahead. So yeah, Pierce was a wonderful player and a great team man.
Yeah. 1976 is a big year for you, John. You win the Leinster Senior Cup, as I said, but in January of that year, you'd make your debut for Ireland. You're barely 20 years old. It's just fascinating to think back now of a 19, 20-year-old playing in front of 50,000 people against Australia. But the question I had was, hoping you could shed some light on it, is nowadays international players kind of earmarked from maybe 16 years old, you know, and they come through the system and you can predict with quite a bit of accuracy whether they're going to make it or not. But back then, how did you find out how it's been picked for Ireland decided? Like committees, I understand.
The big five selectors picked it, and it was absolutely bizarre. But I think I was one of the people who, from a young age, people were looking at me. And that Leinster school win was, I mean, it was unbelievable. High school had never won it before. We got to the semi-final the year before, so we had a good side. And because of the year before, we weren't frightened of the Terranures, the Blackrocks, the Belvederes. We weren't frightened of them. You know, the big Gurrier Catholic schools. We were the little sort of posh Protestants, you know. And we had a side that was very good. And we also had a fly half called Ian Burns, the late Ian Burns, my dear friend Ian Burns. And at school level, I kid you not, you know, Tony Ward and Ollie Campbell were great players, but at school level, Ian Burns was more highly rated. He was absolutely devastating. We had a great pack of forwards, and as a result, we got an armchair ride and we were able to help win the cup. And if you think about it, I don't know how you are on literary matters, Jeremy, but Robbie Burns is the second most published English poet behind William Shakespeare. He's a Scotsman, exactly, a Scotsman, Robbie Burns. I'm shot for that. And suddenly you had halfbacks in this we got ridiculous publicity called Robbie and Burns. So they had these dreadful headlines like Robbie Burns, poetry in motion. And it gave us, we were people being watched. And then I captained the Leinster under-19s for 2 years, which was very, very rare. And we had some great wins. A coach called Ollie Burke was a marvelous, marvelous coach. And the youngest sister of Mary Robbins, by the way, now lives in Timaru, New Zealand. And so I was a rugby fanatic. That was all I cared about. I ate, slept, and drank rugby. So I knew my rugby. And went into Trinity, and Rolly Meads was there. And because John Boyd, who's I think the chairman of Trinity now, because he got injured, I got playing at scrum half, and I happened to kick goals in those days and kicked everything that moved. I played in the colours match on the wing as a youngster. Then the next year I played on the seconds for Trinity, then came through as captain, the youngest captain ever of the world's oldest continuous club. And we had a shocking year with the first team, the year I was on the seconds. And we brought it in and we managed to pull it together and have this fantastic year. And Leinster were doing badly. And for the last Interpro, they dropped Mickey Quinn and Johnny Maloney and some others. And they put me and a youngster called Ollie Campbell in at fly half. And we beat Ulster and beat them well. And I got a lot of headlines, but Ollie was the absolute star that day. He was brilliant. Tony Enza captained the team, I think the only time ever. And we ran the ball and we smashed Ulster, and it was a great win. And then the Irish trial was announced. And what they used to do was, everyone hated playing in the Irish trial, but you had to go through it in order to get selected. And what they did was, they picked the two teams and reserves. And then they announced a training party to train on the Sunday. And late that night, so that was announced after the selectors met. Then they went back in and they announced the team that was going to play. So they announced at whatever time the training party for people who had to train the next day. And then they came back a few hours later and announced the team. And I presume they did that so people could get their ducks in a row about travel arrangements for Lansdowne Road. So I wasn't in the final trial. There were 4 scrum halves. There was Robbie McGrath, there was Johnny Maloney, there was Donald Caniff, and there was, a guy from Ulster, a good player from Ulster. So I was left out, and I was mildly disappointed. I thought maybe I might have been on the bench for the trial. And so then they announced the squad, including all 4 of those scrum halves, for training the next day. And I went down to the Burnaby. I didn't drink in those days. I've made up for it since. And I was watching Match of the Day with my mates. And my dad phoned, we lived just up Church Road from the Burnaby. And my dad phoned and said, Rolly Meads, the coach, has just phoned, the Irish coach, and you've got to come back because he wants to speak to you. And I thought to myself, maybe one of the players from the training squad has got injured and they want me to come in or something. So that'll be nice. Maybe I'll get a tracksuit out of it, Went up. And then Rolly said, you're picked on the Irish team to play Australia. So having not been one of the top 4 scrum halves, so I don't know what they had with their tea time. They must have had plenty of drinks, because between not picking me for the training squad and I was picked to play for Ireland, and it was just ridiculous. And that was the start of it all. Somehow I don't think it would have quite happened today, but it was ridiculous. But I was marked. I was someone who people were looking at from an early age. Yeah.
You'd be regular in the Irish team. You'd travel to New Zealand, I think, in '77, and around that same time,
76. That year, it was the end of that
76,
year.
76, yeah. I think the following year, then you went to Cambridge University, where you, surprise, surprise, were captain as well.
There's another story about that, by the way. Because,
go ahead. Yeah.
I went to Cambridge, and it was amazing. I mean, academically, I don't really quite know what I was doing there, but it was fantastic, and I learned an awful lot. And this ties in with Greystones. What I learned at Cambridge ties in with Greystones on the rugby side, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But Eddie Butler, who's of course now the doyen of rugby commentators, he was a magnificent rugby player, number 8, played for Pontypool and played for Cambridge, and he was brilliant, and he was larger than life, and he was fun, and he was a tough bugger, he was a tough bugger. They used to call him Bamba Gascoigne or Lord Snooty in Pontypool, because they considered him very posh, Cambridge and a public school. But he was odds on. Alistair Hignell was captain the first year. We lost in the varsity match in a shocking day. Again, I have bad feelings about that. But then we had this election meeting, and Eddie was going to be captain. He'd been vice captain the year before. So we were all pissed going into this meeting, because it was just get through the formalities of electing the captain, and then we'll go out and celebrate Eddie Butler being captain. And in one of the games against London Scottish that year, coming back on the bus, we'd been heavily beaten, and Eddie, he played brilliantly, but he was being a bit of an idiot. And for some reason, I had a bit of a go at him on the bus. And I said, Eddie, do you not realize how good you are? And you're not setting an example. I just had a bit of a go. And I'd forgotten about it. A few beers on board and forgotten about it. But it obviously made an impression on some of the players, because Eddie was great, but he was larger than life. He wasn't an organizer. And of course, from Trinity, I'd been an organizer. I controlled things. And we were drunk at the election meeting, and they said, nominations for captain, Eddie Butler, second, right, show of hands, whatever. And then Ian Gregg, the brother of Tony Gregg, the famous cricketer, said, sorry, I have another nomination. And everyone said, what? And he said, I nominate John Robbie. I said, oh, John Robbie nominated, seconded, went to a vote, and there, drunk as a skunk, I was captain of Cambridge with Eddie Butler, and the first person who came up and congratulated me was Eddie Butler, and that was it. So I was captain of Cambridge, and I don't know why people kept making me captain, but in a funny sort of a way, I was one of those guys who always played better as captain. In there, I always had this slight nagging doubt about my ability. But when I was captain, I knew I could control things and so on. But I captained everybody except Ireland, which probably was the one great regret I had. But there you are. Yeah.
In 1979, you'd moved back to Greystones. You get a job with Guinness. And it's funny because now in 2022, if you look at there's the town, there's a lot of young guys playing for Lansdowne, Trinity, Belvedere, local Greystones guys. And it was no different for you in the early 70s. Local guys playing in, look at Paul McNaughton with Wanderers, or Pierce Power and yourself at Trinity. But the big change for Greystones was that they gained senior status. Was that a huge incentive for you coming back? Because you can't help but feel nowadays Greystones play in the equivalent of Division 4. You can't help but feel, if we got up to Division 3, Division 2, maybe those local guys would see Greystones as a viable option again. Was that the same in your day, 1979, when you come back?
Yeah, what happened was, I was Trinity. I wasn't the usual Presbray, maybe UCD, then Greystones, which was the usual. All my mates did that, the guys I grew up with. And bear in mind, I'd been part of Greystones because I lived there. I played there. in 1965, I can remember when the English team trained at Greystones when I was a little kid. I think I was 9. And I can remember Doc Hickey giving me sixpence to stand behind the post to collect the ball when it went into the ditch. I can remember the fire in the old clubhouse. I played junior rugby. Guys like Larky O'Brien and Jock Wilson used to pass me the ball when I was a little kid, almost showing off this little kid who could play rugby. I'd gone to the discos, and I'll confess, Mick O'Mara used to let me in free to the discos, So I'd grown up in Greystones, and then I played with Greystones under 19. Mick Dunn, who was just a wonderful coach. Mick Dunn was a wonderful coach. And in all my career, I've never met someone who made players feel so good about themselves as Mick Dunn. He was absolutely brilliant. Coached the under 19s. And then, of course, as the season started, I went to Trinity. Then suddenly I'm high school, I'm Trinity, I'm Cambridge. And there was a lot of speculation where I'd go. And for example, I mean, even though they had Robbie McGrath, Wanderers asked me to guest for them. Wesley asked me to guest for them at Christmas time, out of season. I even played for Pontypool, the famous Pontypool side with Eddie Butler. I was pissed in Cambridge saying, oh, Welsh club rugby. My mother was Welsh. I've always wanted to play. And I woke up in the morning discovering I was playing for Pontypool on Saturday against Tredegar. So with the Pontypool front row and the great side. But I knew that Greystones had a massive potential. I'd actually gone to see them playing against Malone in the holidays. And I looked at Paul McNaughton and I looked at Fergie Nolan and Simon Doyle on the wing. And they played just this beautiful. They smashed Malone. And I just thought to myself, hang on, and I was going to live in Greystones, and I thought there's something special here. But I just felt there's no way I'm going to announce I'm coming to Greystones. I mean, how arrogant can that be? You'd all sorts of Tony Doyle, for example, was there. Jeannie Murphy was there. Scrum halves, very good scrum halves. I mean, Tony played for Ireland. And I thought, how arrogant could I be to say I was coming to Greystones? But my heart was always there, and Greystones, when I went to Cambridge, gave me a very generous little gift to help me out there and so on. But I never said a word, and Greystones never said to me, are you coming to join? But it was quite a big issue. Who is John Robbie going to join? And I remember we went to Jack McVitie, the heart and soul of Greystones, an absolute legend who lived and breathed rugby and Greystones. And, didn't have kids, Margaret and him. And I was sort of the son he'd never had. And he invited me to the Lansdowne dinner. And we went to the Lansdowne dinner, and those, came back in the car, and I let slip that I was joining Greystones. I said, oh, when we play next year. And it was like, a Masonic word had been uttered. And Jack pulled the car over and said, are you joining Greystones? I said, yeah, well, of course I'm joining. Who else do you think I'm going to join, Jack? And then I don't know what happened, but behind the scenes, things started to happen, because I'd never played senior rugby for Greystones. I'd guested a few times at Christmas and so on, but I'd never actually been a member of the club. I was never a paid-up member of Greystones. I was a junior and so on. And next second, they said to me, will you be captain? And I said, how can I be captain of Greystones? I've never officially been, but wheels went behind the scenes. And I remember we had a big meeting at the Burnaby Hotel. Liam Byrne opened the Burnaby Hill, and the whole club was there. And because now I thought, hang on a second, I've lived Greystones. I've been there longer than most people. I've played junior Greystones, and I've got something to offer. I could see this potential in this Greystones team. And also, even though in Trinity we had a great pack of forwards, Mike Gibson, Donald Spring, Ollie Waldron, and not a great backline, but a great goal kicker. We played a very, very conservative type of game, with a lot of kicking from me and Dr. Willie Ryan, the fly half. Very conservative game. I'd gone to Cambridge, where they had a tiny pack of students against, Leicester, Northampton, all the big clubs. And they had a wonderful coach called Ian Robertson, Scotsman, who rescued the varsity match. And they played magnificent rugby. They just ran everything. All their training was to do with skills. And they had a guy who a lot of people forget. He was a junior All Black called Murray Meikle, who was a lecturer in dentistry. And he got the Cambridge pack rucking. In those days, everyone mauled, a bit like it was mauling. And Cambridge used to ruck the ball in, out, move it away, and, played marvelous rugby. And I thought to myself, hold on a second, looking at Irish rugby, we can do what Cambridge did with Greystones. So I suddenly thought, and, Paul McNaught, Johnny Murphy was there, Jerome, these were wonderful players. And I thought, just hang on a second, there's a chance to come in and use my experience and maybe up things a little bit. And also Willow Murray, the coach, was a wonderful coach. I mean, he really was an encyclopedia of rugby, the loveliest man. And in those days, I was very bullshit. I mean, I don't think arrogant is the word. I just knew that I could do something. And I was a little bit odd. Because all I could really talk about was rugby. And coming in from the outside, I knew there'd be I had an opportunity to change things in a way that maybe someone who'd been at the club for years wouldn't be able to do it. And I remember I got Eddie Butler and Nigel Heath, who was the lock forward and secretary of Cambridge. They came over for a holiday in Ireland and stayed with us. And I remember getting them to come to Greystones and teach rucking. teach rucking, and they taught the forwards how to ruck. And for particularly that first year, we were the only team. We had the world's smallest pack of forwards. I mean, our two locks, Son Kenny and Tim Kelly, were about 6'1", and I think Big Tom Morley was 6'4" or whatever. But the rest, it was like something out of Lord of the Rings. We were hobbits. But what we used to do was we used to hit those rucks. And we even took it one step forward, because the key to rucking, as Murray Meikle explained, and this is why the All Blacks were so great, New Zealand teams, was that you don't hit the rucks one at a time. The guy coming first waits until another guy binds, and you hit the rucks two at a time. And that adds, it's almost like a multiplier effect. And then what the guys used to do was, we had them putting their arms out like that, and they'd link up and they'd hit the rucks. And being the captain and scrum half, I used to control it all. So if something happened, I would shout, aeroplanes. And the guys would put their arms up, grab in, and we hit these rucks. And we'd win 3-4 rucks and end up with a 4-man overlap that would put Simon Doyle in for a try. And other teams, I mean, we went up to Bangor, who were one of the top sides in Ulster, and we beat them by 35 points to 3 or something. And the Bangor coach who went on to coach Ulster told Mick Dunn recently, there's the greatest club performance he'd ever seen. But there's a great story about it, which I don't know if you've heard about it, and it goes back to aeroplanes. And this is a story that Willie John McBride tells. He tells it at dinners, and I'm so proud because he's obviously a great hero. We got to the league final. We beat Blackrock in the semi-final. Amazing game. Try in the last minute. We beat Blackrock, who had a very strong side. We got to the final against St Mary's. Now we ran everything, and amazingly we lost 3-0 to a drop goal. But it was an amazing open game. I know that sounds ridiculous, but we played brilliantly. I should have varied tactics a bit, but in the final early on, the ball went down the right, came back on the left, and Terry Kennedy, the Irish winger, dropped the ball. And I saw this situation, and I screamed just in front of the grandstand, packed grandstand, and I screamed, aeroplanes, aeroplanes. Now, they had a prop forward called Tojo Byrne, who was a butcher, and he was built like that. He was, as wide as he was high. And when the ball had gone either side and back, he just stayed out on this wing. So in front of the grandstand, Terry Kennedy dropped the ball. Our forwards were arriving. I shouted, aeroplanes, aeroplanes. And Tojo dropped on the ball shouting, Mayday, Mayday. And all the players, the referee and the crowd stopped and laughed for a few minutes in a league final. And I'm proud to say Willie John McBride tells that story, and great moment.
Yeah, immortalized. Very good. Wrexham Sevens, talk to me about that.
Wrexham Sevens was a big sevens tournament in North Wales, and they got some good, I remember we played the one year and we lost in the semi-final. I remember Mike Slemon, who went on the British Lions tour, sadly passed away recently. He was the star that year, and Liverpool won it, aside from Liverpool. And the next year we went, and Mick Dunn was the coach. And my goodness, we were so organized. We had a medical team for blisters. We had a dietitian. We did everything. And we won the Wrexham Sevens. Dara Coakley guested for us, I remember. And we went and absolutely won it. And that set the tone for the season. With organization and a bit of ability, you can actually win things. And it was marvelous. I think about I don't know, 50 Greystones supporters came over. Wow. Led by Mike Vitti and so on. And it was a wonder. I haven't thought about that for years, but it was still very proud of the trophy I have.
Yeah. It's funny, as that first season closes out, 1979, 1980, your first season back with Greystones. You're club captain, you're captain of Leinster, you're an Irish international. And it's hard to believe you're only 24. And you weren't done yet, because 1980, you become a Lion. Is this the pinnacle of your career?
Yeah, definitely. With the exception of the tour to New Zealand in 1976, my Irish career was a bit of a disaster. We didn't have a good side. There was chopping and changing, and because we were losing, the old adage, if a team is losing, you always change the halfbacks. So you had Robbie McGrath, Donald Caniff, Johnny Maloney, then Colin Patterson, the great Colin Patterson, who came in and I was never happy in an Irish shirt. And in 1977, when I was just the second year, they went to New Zealand, and Gareth Edwards wasn't going, the great Gareth Edwards, and Bryn Mawr Williams, the Welsh scrum half, was obviously going to go because most of the team were Welsh. And the other spot was between myself and Dougie Morgan of Scotland. And he was a great player, and he was older, and he was ahead of me in the pecking order. But we played in Murrayfield, and despite the fact that we lost 21-18, in a very good game, the powers that be decided I'd had a very good game. They decided I was in the mix. So I had a chance of getting either into the 77 Lions or on the bench. And then there was a month before the final international. We played France at Lansdowne Road, and the French were magnificent. They won the Grand Slam. They won the Grand Slam without conceding a try that year. Can you believe it? And they were immense. But we were playing France, and Scotland were playing Wales in Murrayfield. And I never trained. I trained every single day for a month, which in those days was, unheard of in amateur rugby. And then after 2 minutes, I broke my leg. I broke my leg against France, and I was out. And Dougie went, and Alan Lewis was a replacement. So I thought that was my Lions gone. Then after the broken leg, I didn't get back in. And then Colin Patterson came in, and it was great, and I was off. So I thought that's it. Then the year 1980, it was a very controversial year, not so much because of the anti-apartheid movement, unlike the next year in Ireland. But what the real controversy was, in the Six Nations that year, England won the Grand Slam under Billy Beaumont. And they played Wales in Cardiff or Twickenham. In one of them, they played Wales. And it was a very dirty match. And Paul Ringer, the Welsh flanker, was sent off by Dave Burnett, the Irish referee. And so there was very bad feeling against England in Wales. There really was bad feeling. And the Lions team was selected, and I wasn't on it. And for the Easter tour, the Barbarians Easter tour, which used to go, it was still marvelous. They picked a Barbarian side with none of the Lions on it. But what they did was, in order to win the Welsh over, Billy Beaumont played in the game against Cardiff, which was one of the few games that was shown live on television. Cardiff against the Barbarians on the Easter tour. Every year it was shown live. 20,000 in the Cardiff Arms Park, the small stadium, and it was a great game. And I just had one of those games where everything worked. Every kick worked, every break worked, every pass worked, whatever. I had a really good game. And after the game, Sid Muller said, "You're an official replacement for the Lions." And then, of course, I went with Leinster to Romania, which was an amazing trip. Paul McNaughton's on that trip. Hugo McNeil, I think, made his debut. Paul Dean made his debut. And the Romanians were a fully professional side. They were as good a side as anyone in the world in those days. We lost the first game, came back with a great win in the second game. And then I went to dig the garden. It's summer, stay at home, have a break from rugby. And then Ian Robertson, my former coach, phoned and said, "Look, there's a game in Zimbabwe between the Goshawks, which were their Barbarians, and the Quackers, which was then the South African Barbarians. They're looking for a couple of internationals. Would you like to go? It's a week in Zimbabwe." And my wife, Jenny, said, I was just back from, Romania. And she said, "Oh, you'll never get a chance to go to Africa. Ho, ho." And so I went for a game. And in the dressing room before we played against the Quackers in Bulawayo, someone stuck his nose in and said, we just had a phone call from Sid Muller with the Lions. They'd played about 4 or 5 games in South Africa. They were unbeaten. And they said, "Terry Holmes is injured. You've got to play today and then join the Lions tomorrow." And my God, I didn't go near a ball. And that was my Lions tour. And, I would have gone, I think it was James Haskell said when he got picked as a replacement, I would have gone and carried the bags. I'd have washed the shirts. And I was exactly the same. And so with no pressure, because I was a Lion, I remember helping Terry Holmes and Colin Patterson. I'd said, I don't care. But because there was no pressure, I seemed to be playing very well. And then I got myself into the test side and played in the winning test in the final game. So, as a 66-year-old granddad who's half crippled with arthritis now, I can hardly believe talking to you. But it was extraordinary. In fact, most of the things were extraordinary that I've been talking to you about. Yeah,
it's funny. Like even you talked about like Lawrence Dallaglio said he won a World Cup, but the Lions in '97, that was the highlight of his career. And even looking at your Twitter, your cover page is your Lions, and your Lions number, I think, are you 980? What number Lion?
No, it's 754 or something. I'm right beside Ollie Campbell.
Oh, very good.
One of the greatest players I've
Yeah.
ever played, and is my best rugby mate. So
Yeah, it's funny
I'm
all these
I'm
years
very
later.
proud of that.
Yeah. 7th of February 1981, Ireland v France, your return game, and it's the one and only time, I think, if I'm correct, that you're wearing an Irish jersey with Paul McNaughton. Must have been a nice experience getting to share a pitch with him for Ireland.
Paul was brilliant and has never gotten the credit he deserved. He was a marvelous player, one of the brightest players I've ever seen. Used his Gaelic skills to collect the high ball, but he just brought something to a team. You know, he brought that organisation in midfield, and he was brilliant. But then, of course, the Campbell Ward controversy was raging, and what we lost narrowly that game, and you know, Hugo McNeill's debut. Hugo McNeill scored a try on his debut against France, and we had a very, very good side. But the selectors then bottled, and what they did was they dropped. I think David Irwin was coming in. Was David Irwin in that game? I think David Irwin played in that game. Another marvelous player. So Paul and David in the centre was a potent combination. Hugo at fly half. I like to think me and Ollie at scrum half would have been a really good side. Frank Quinn was on the wing, and then I think to get away from the controversy, or maybe Munster selectors or whatever, they put Wardy at fly half and dropped Paul McNaughton. Yeah. And I'm not going to say it was a disaster. We got the wooden spoon that year, but we were ahead in every single game, and hardly, you know, it was just one of those seasons. But I always remember on the Lions tour, Ray Gravel, the late Ray Gravel, asking me about this Paul McNaughton, because in Wales they rated him. Now, he wouldn't have been able to go on the Lions because obviously he worked for the IDA and there was the controversy. But Paul was right up there. But yeah. When I was captain of Greystones, the one thing I insisted was we wore club ties to games, and he didn't like that. Paul didn't like that. So I had a good chuckle when he was made manager of the Irish team, enforcing discipline and everything. You bastard, you wouldn't wear a tie.
Very good. That's brilliant. 2 weeks later, on the bench for the first time, I believe, it could have been England or a Scotland game, is Johnny Murphy. Do you have any memories of Johnny coming into
Johnny, yes, he was.
Johnny was coming into the Irish squad.
Johnny was thereabouts, and because he'd been fantastic. I mean, bear in mind, Greystones had been travelling up and down the country, enthralling the spectators. That we literally did. We didn't win every game, because when you played against when you played against the Wesleys of the world and the Lansdowne, although we, you know, hammered Lansdowne later, I wasn't playing the day before I left to go to South Africa to emigrate. But people knew with Greystones, and we almost became a sort of a cult team. And it was so fantastic with this quick ball we got, with the rucking, with the moving. And Jerome O'Brien, to this day, is the best fly half I've ever come across at straightening a line. And as you know, in nowadays with professional rugby, everyone straightens. But in those days, everyone used to drift. And of course, if you drift, to hit the line with pace, the fullback has to be like an Olympic sprinter, because you're drifting across. But if you run straight, he can hit the line. And Johnny Murphy, with that build of his, was fabulous. So Johnny became a bit of a legend, his goal kicking. And then, of course, when Hugo didn't go to South Africa, Johnny went and played in the first test, got injured. And Tom Kiernan, who sadly passed away, the late Tom Kiernan, who was manager on that tour, says it was the best performance he's ever seen by a fullback in an Irish jersey. Wow. That game that Johnny Murphy of Greystones played in Cape Town, and again the characters we had, they were fabulous. And it's a lesson, you know, that selectors and maybe coaches don't get. Sometimes the guy with the best ability just doesn't fit into the side. It's the mix is the key thing. I mean, if you look at my other great favorite team is Manchester United. And they've got these wonderful players, and yet they're so absolutely crap at the moment, you know, with these players. And that's to do with mix. And I've played with teams with a great mix and not a great mix. And luckily that Greystones team had a great mix.
You brought it up just there, the 1981 tour to South Africa. I know you're probably sick of talking about it, but I read your article in the Irish Times and the Guardian. And I know what you're going to say, it's a stain that will stay with you for the rest of your life. And that article, I think it mentions it 3 times. I mean, maybe it only mentions that you played for Ireland twice. The whole article focused on the controversy of traveling over there. I just wondered, John, is life not more nuanced than that? I mean, are you really wise to be holding your 25-year-old self accountable to a decision that,
to thine own self be true. To thine own self be true. I mean, that's what Hugo McNeil and Ollie and guys like and Tony Ward, who the latter two sort of didn't go, and they say to the same thing, get over it. But I always feel if you don't stand up and say, I look back now with shame. But how many of us look back at things when we were youngsters? Yeah. And there's no shame at what we did when we let ourselves down. As an older person, you would look back in horror. And I suppose it is time to move on. And also the fact that in my radio career, I did make a modest contribution, and I did stand up, and I went against the grain in some ways, and risked some danger in some ways. In a way, that should be it's a sort of catharsis for what happened. But I sort of feel if I having stood up, and then if I don't mention it, and maybe I do it too much, then I have to stand up and say. And I always remember some years ago, I was invited to speak at the Greystones 75th anniversary dinner, and I came over, and we had a marvelous evening. I remember later on the evening saying, my God, it must be after 1 o'clock, and it was 4:45. I'll never forget that. And the chairman of Éire Óg, the Gaelic club, was a young lady, and everyone was like, oh, John, great, wonderful, nice to have you back, well-spoken, brilliant. And this lady came up and said, I was a kid when you went, and I was so disappointed. Oof. And she just said it, she would obviously followed South Africa, Steve Biko, Nelson Mandela, Neil Agate, all these things. And, all I could do is say, you're right. You're absolutely right. But that's something I live with, and I feel I have to keep saying it. And it's easy to say, oh, we were sportsmen, it didn't matter, etc. But deep down, it did. I think,
Well, it's a mark of your character anyway that you're happy to confront it. You'd move over to South Africa, ironically, and live there. I want to just talk about the rugby side. The scrum half in me wants to know so badly, John, what was it like playing in front of a pack of Afrikaners? I mean, you'd said earlier our second rows were 6'1". I mean, you're upgrading that to 6'9" and 200 kilos.
Oh my God! I remember arriving over, and I went to the Wanderers Club, famous rugby club, right beside the cricket stadium, and it was on the up. It was a club that was on the up, and I played there, and I remember the first game, and what they did was, unlike in Irish rugby, because of the rain, when a club plays a club, it starts off at sort of 10 o'clock in the morning, where maybe the 5th team will play, and then the 4th team. It's like curtain raises. So it's not like the seconds are off here. A club plays another club, and everybody plays, and it builds up to the first team game. So I'd been there, and everyone knew I was a British Lion, and I was sort of, everyone was looking, and I'd been impressive in training, and people would laugh at it, but I kept my mouth shut. I never said a word until I'd established myself. I never gave advice, organized. I said, play and do it. And then I remember watching the 3rd game, and the little scrum half there, who was pinging passes off with the old leather ball. A lot of us used to turn to pass because it was very difficult, especially if it was a little bit wet, and they were pinging passes. And then I watched the 2nd team game, and the 2nd team scrum half was even better. It was actually Robbie Russell, who was Brent Russell's father. Do you remember that magnificent, the pocket rocket? Yeah. We should have got 50 caps for South Africa, but because they were so stupid, they didn't. He was playing. I remember thinking, this is the 2nd club and scrum half. And I went out and immediately discovered I could pass off because I was afraid. Now, we played the first game against Pretoria Harlequins, and I managed to drop a goal and made the break that put Ray Mort, the great Ray Mort, in for a try. So I got off for a great start. But then I played in the Transvaal trial. And I remember there was a lock forward called Don Bardenhurst, who was about 6'6.5", broken nose, hands like shovels. I remember saying to one of the Wanderers guys in the trial, I said, Jesus, a lock forward, he's huge. And they said, wait and you see the other one. He's even big, he's even bigger. So it was very, very hard. But the pitches at provincial level were magnificent. You know, even though you see the pitches, the brown pitches in those days, it was what they called kikuyu grass, and it was quite spongy. But if you play, I mean, if you were in a third team player and played away to Ranfontein on a Tuesday night under the light, you know, it was like playing on concrete. But the Afrikaans players were hard players. Often not the brightest, but they were hard players. And I was a much better player in South Africa than I had been in Ireland.
Really? Wow. Why was that? Was that just the opportunity to play with maybe at a higher standard, maybe?
I think it partly that. When I say a higher standard, it was faster because of the weather, particularly up in the high veld. You know, it was magnificent conditions almost every single game, and also I had to toughen up. My biggest regret is I would hate to have played professional rugby. I'd hate to be a professional rugby player today. You know, the thought of every day going to the office in our day, and I sound like an old fart now, but in our day, your rugby was your passion. And it was like after the office had gone, this was your enjoyment and the grind. But the one thing was, I wish I'd done weights and supplements and built up. So I could tackle fine, but I couldn't take too many tackles because I'd have been basically broken. And I learned a lot more about that. And then the other thing that happened was Murray Mexted, who along with Ollie Campbell is one of the greatest, and Danny Gerber, and one of the greatest players I ever played with. He played half a season with us. And Murray's an amazing guy. He's sort of a slightly bohemian, but what a rugby player. And I remember I played in a exhibition game, the opening game of the season at Wits University. They used to play against an invitation side, and Murray and I played for the invitation side. And I was there like, you know, an hour and a half beforehand, warming up, strapping. Murray breezed in jeans and a t-shirt 10 minutes before the game. And he said, "Oh, hello, John. How are you? Nice to meet you." And I said, "Can we have a little bit of a chat?" And so on. He says, "Yeah." He says, "When I do this," he says, "you run that way. When I do this, you run that way." And 8 to 9, he put me through gaps. I mean, it was unbelievable. I learned more about number 8 and scrum half play in that one game. And then he played half a season with us. And then what happened was I had the Rosetta Stone of playing 8 and 9. And even today, most of them don't get it. They don't get the timing between 8 and 9 left or 8 and 9 right. And we decimated people. So even though I was a good passer of the ball, I was a good kicker of the ball, I was a good cover of the ball, a good reader of the game, my big weakness was because I wasn't strong enough. I couldn't take on, you know, if there was a gap there, I could do it. But now suddenly, with being put away by a number 8, I was a threat as a runner as well. And of course, the other thing, I could drop goals. Someone told me the other day, in 83 games for Transvaal, I dropped 23 goals, including 3 in a big cup final.
How do you do that from scrum half, though? I mean, like, you're just stepping out for the ruck or catching it in open play?
Easiest thing, especially from a scrum, because all you'd have to do is say to the flanker, "Watch out for the offside," and then take it, step backwards, and drop goal. Oh. And I mean, that was one of the things. Even today, people will remember about me. So the beauty was that I made myself more of a threat in South Africa because basically of Murray Mexted and played for South Africa, but didn't get a cap. But then amazingly, and this is something I only learned during the Lions tour. During this Lions tour, and I mean, sort of, you know, it sounds a bit immodest, but it means a lot to me. There was a book written here about all the history of the Lions tours. And this woman who I used to work with, who's a bit of a literary fundy, she was reviewing the book. And one of the people she got on, she had a few guests lined up. One of them was Hannes Maria, who was the famous Springbok prop, who captained the Springboks against the 74 Lions when they were hammered. But he was a legendary player, official, and selector. And he was one of the people who was speaking before me, and then go to the next interview, and then I do the interview about playing for the Lions. And he said to Jenny Cruz-Williams, "Before John Robbie comes on, I want to tell him something." I said, "What?" He says, "I want to tell him something. You're not allowed to say, well, I'm not saying what it is. I want to speak to John Robbie when you hand it over." And I began to think, oh my goodness, what have I done wrong? And then he came on, and he's an elderly man now. Jesus, I'm an elderly man now. He says, "John, I've got something to tell you." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You were selected to play for South Africa against England in 1984. And I said, No, Hannes, I was on the bench. I was on the bench that game. He says, no, I was a selector. You were actually selected to play for South Africa in the team. Divan Serfontein was scrum half. And then right at the end of the meeting, before we announced the team, one of the selectors said, won't there be a row if against England of all people? Now, bear in mind the Afrikaans English Boer War sentiment was still is with some, but was very strong in those days. And somebody said, if we pick this Engelsman, meaning an English speaker, rather than there might be a backlash against it.
Wow.
They changed it. So not alone did I sit on the bench for South Africa, play on an internal, I was actually selected for South Africa. Now, it doesn't matter a damn in this day and age, but it's kind of nice.
Bit of trivia, yeah.
My good friend, Emmett O'Rafferty, who was great lock forward with Wanderers and was marvellous on that 76 tour. He was selected to play for Ireland against France and then pulled out. He could have feigned the injury. He could have pretended he was okay. And he pulled out and never got capped again, got injured. So I share something with Emmett that I was actually selected.
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to have to talk to me about Peter Muller. You'd finished playing for Greystones. You'd finished playing rugby at this stage, but it's funny. 10 years after you'd emigrated, you're still pulling the strings for the club.
Yeah, I think I've quit while I was ahead. What happened was, the quest for senior rugby was something that went on for sort of, 15, 20 years. And you had marvelous people like Jim Doyle, obviously Jack McVitie, Niall Keeney, Donald O'Sullivan. This was an absolute quest. Could Greystones get senior? And it was fantastic. And then when they finally got senior, it was like the Holy Grail. Greystones was a senior club. And, as we've talked about what happened then, we became a top senior club. And then when I left, and then when they brought in the leagues, and Greystones were having a bad season. I don't know the details of it, but they were having a bad season. And of course, if they got relegated, all the problems that you mentioned, like, people going to a different club, not coming in, etc. And a lot of the people in Greystones thought all that quest that we were on, that Holy Grail, is going to go because we're going to be relegated. We're a junior club once again. And so Jack McVitie got in touch with me and said, John, we need something in the center, in the back line. We need a guy who will galvanize the back line, something in the back line. Can you think of something? And I was good mates with Helgaard Muller, who got one cap for South Africa, brilliant center in the Free State. And he was a very good friend of mine. And funnily enough, came over to Ireland once later on, but sorry, I'm jumping the gun. And his younger brother, Peter Muller, was just starting to make waves with the Free State. And he was about 6'3" and about 16 stone, and he could run like a stag. And he had a nasty, hard streak to him as well. And I met him, and he was a lovely guy. He was a very keen guy. He was, it sounds ridiculous. He was interested in cooking. He was interested in other things. He wasn't just your typical rugby player. And it was 1987, I think. It was 1991. And it was before the World Cup, the first World Cup in the UK and Ireland. And I was just chatting to Peter somewhere. I didn't know him very, very well. And he said, he was in a bit of a dead end. I can't remember what he was doing. And I said, would you fancy playing overseas for a bit? And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, they've got this little club, Greystones. They play wonderful, wonderful rugby. You'll probably have more fun playing for Greystones than any other club. And if I could arrange it, would you like to go? And Peter said he'd jump at it. And of course, when you recommend somebody to a club, you don't know if the guy's a head case, but you don't know if he's a serial killer or whatever. And so Peter went over and ended up having this fantastic season and saving the club. And I'm so delighted that now, when anyone speaks to Peter Muller, he mentions his time in Greystones with great fondness.
He does.
And then, of course, went on to become a legend with South Africa.
Yeah, I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago when he was telling me how you'd sold him on the community aspect of Greystones as much as anything. And how, if you look at other parts of the world to play rugby in, you might just be playing rugby and, then you're in a city and you're in a nothing, what's that?
Exactly.
If you're in Greystones, there's the main street and there's Bray and Jim Doyle's or whatever. And yeah, it's amazing that you're still orchestrating things. The scrum halves never lose their way, do they?
I don't think I ever did it again because I wanted to quit while I was ahead.
Yeah.
The man who brought Peter Muller. And then, of course, when he played in that famous game, the Springboks against the All Blacks in 1992, when the Springboks got back into rugby, one of the great games. And even though they were beaten by the All Blacks, there was 9-25 or something, and Peter scored a try on his debut, which was it was amazing.
Just quickly, you mentioned that he'd stayed the night in your house the night before he left.
Yeah, before he went to, I mean, he'd never been out of South Africa before, and I don't think he'd been out of a rugby playing area. And so before he went off on his great adventure to Greystones, he stayed with us here in this house it wouldn't have been in this, it would have been our old house in Johannesburg. We moved here in 94, and he was very, very nervous and very, very excited. But we'd said to him, now look, whatever you do, when you go through customs, you put holiday. You're going on holiday. You're not working, because then you need things like work permits and all this sort of stuff. So Peter panicked at Dublin Airport, and I think he said he had a work permit, and he was working, and he didn't. And there was nearly an incident at Dublin Airport, and it was all sudden. He didn't speak great English at that time. He was a very Afrikaans kid. But I think probably McVitie knew somebody in customs or something, or Jim Doyle knew something, and they managed to get him through. But there was a great story they told me, because Greystones had this welcoming party. All the big knobs of Greystones were there welcoming this South African centre. So they were looking for this South African centre to come through, and gradually everybody went through, and then he wasn't there. There was nobody there. And of course, the reason was they were looking for a centre. And this 6'3", 4" guy walked straight past them. And I think they took him straight to Jim Doyle's and sorted him out. And but geez, these are memories that I thought I'd forgotten, Jeremy.
We're nearly finished, but I have to ask, because I don't know if I'll ever get to ask this question to anybody ever again in my life. What is Nelson Mandela like? How did you meet him?
Wonderful. I am one of two people that Nelson Mandela has told publicly to shut up. Only two people he publicly told to shut up. One was Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton criticized Mandela for supporting Fidel Castro and Cuba. And the other one was at a dinner where we were sitting with Nelson Mandela. And Mandela had this aura about him. First of all, he's huge. The pictures do no justice to him, because he was a big, big man and hands like bunches of bananas. And we were invited to a function in Pretoria for the media just before he became president. And I remember we were sitting in this big welcoming hall up at the presidential building, and we were sitting on the side because we were this little private radio station. We were the baddies. The SABC was the state broadcasters. And my wife, Jenny, was sitting there. Next second, this bunch of bananas was on her shoulder. And he gave the welcoming address with his hand on my wife, Jenny's shoulder. And I think she's never forgotten it, and so on. But he had a great sense of humor, but he had this quality about him. I mean, bear in mind, you're talking about the most famous man in the world, a man who got put away for 27 years, a man who came out with not a hint of bitterness, and yet was no patsy. He wasn't a pushover. And what happened was he was sitting with all the big shots. And what I did was I got the menu, which is framed over there, and signed by him. And I wrote a cheeky note and said, would the president redistribute himself to the table at the far end? We want to talk to you. And this is not a long walk. Long Walk to Freedom was his book. Yeah. And he picked it up, and I gave it to a waiter. I should never have done it. The waiter could have got fired. I gave him the note, and Mandela stood up and looked, and we all cheered. So he came up and sat with us for 3/4 of an hour to an hour. Wow. And I've seen it with Mandela, because I did a few functions introducing him in MC work and so on. I never got him on the radio, which was very good reasons for that. But when Mandela sat down, it was like being in the presence of a divinity. Yeah. And I saw top business people would find themselves stuck for words. And, people couldn't, I once used the greatest name drop ever. I said, all these businessmen were like this. This was a little bit earlier. And then I said, greatest name drop ever. I said, you probably know my old friend, Tony O'Reilly. Mandela, oh, yes, chatted and broke the ice. But this time, he sat down at the table and no one knew what to say to him. And I thought to myself, it's not often you get the chance. So I said, do you mind me asking you a question? I said, you'll speak to all the people who put you in jail, the leaders of the National Party. You've spoken to Vavut's wife. You've done it. You won't speak to Chief Buthelezi. Now, there was a big political row going on between the IFP and the ANC. Sorry, there's a lawnmower going in the background.
It's okay.
In the garden. And this was a very hot issue at the time. And Mandela says, oh, no, wait. And he started talking. And I was interviewing him in the studio, and I had a fairly robust style of interviewing. At one stage, they digited out. I said, what about? And he said to me, now, yo, shut up for a minute. You are not on the radio now. And then he smiled and went on. And I mean, I learned from Mandela, a wonderful man. No saint, as he said himself. And my ultimate hero was Archbishop Tutu, who's just died. Who came on a number of times, and I got to know him quite well. And they had that gift that so many great people have of, despite the problems, and there were massive problems in the country. The country was on the verge of a civil war at times. That now poverty and all sorts of issues. It's not in a great place, South Africa, at the moment. But the great leaders have that ability without minimizing. You look a clown like Boris Johnson or a clown like Trump. It's all just tough up front. Yeah. But these people have the ability, without minimizing the seriousness of the issues, they will always find something positive. They'll always find a bit of humor in the situation. They'll always look on the optimistic side. And that's what I loved about that generation. But sadly, in the current South African leadership, they are few and far between at the moment. But to say that I was one of the two people Mandela told to shut up is something I'm very, very, very proud of, Jeremy.
A boy from Greystones went pretty far in life if he's sitting there getting told to shut up by Nelson Mandela. John, that's nearly us done. But I do want to ask you two questions before we go. Give me your favourite Greystones Rugby Club memory.
Oh, well, my greatest memory was the airplane story. The airplane story with the rocket. That was for me the greatest. And the other great one was my record for Ireland became something as a joke, as I got cap after cap. And we were only belted once in my whole 9 caps. We only were belted once by France in Paris. We lost 23-3 or something. But the guys used to rag me a little bit. Oh, how many games have you won for Ireland? Whatever. Particularly McNaughton used to rag me about that. How many games have you played for Ireland? Whatever. Have you won for Ireland? You see. And then against Wales, in a famous victory over Wales, I think Paul was given a pass on the line, and as he was diving over the line, he knocked the ball on. Okay, and didn't score, but Ireland won. Whatever. And of course, the first training session after the game, Tuesday night, we arrived. And I think it was Son Kenny or John Murphy or one of the team was full of characters at the side. And as he came out, it just said, Paul McNaughton. Paul McNaughton. And I think for the rest of his Greystones time, Macca was known as Paul McNaughton. So those were the sort of memories I have.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, who's the best player you played with the Greystones?
Best player played with the Greystones. Oh gosh, Paul McNaughton.
Paul as well.
Paul McNaughton would have been, but we had wonderful, and many of them were unsung. I mentioned Pierce Park. Tom Morley was a terrific. Desi O'Leary. I mean, as a hooker, he was a small little guy, and we had a small pack. But he gave. And another thing I took from Cambridge was Channel 1 ball. If you're going to engage and it's going to be down, you're going to get smashed by the Wesleys and Palmerstons of the world. So we used to take in, out, and away. And Desi, Johnny Cantrell of Ireland was another great one at that. To give me that Channel 1 ball, so as you're getting it away, you can get it away. Johnny Murphy, I mean, and Fergie Nolan in the centre, and as I said, Jerome O'Brien, another one. I mean, there were Joe Boyle as well. John O'Gorman, these were guys who played in a pack. That to pick an individual player is really unfair, because what we were was that
more some of your parts,
the sum of the parts. But if you had to say to me, I would say Paul McNaughton was an absolute classic, and also he had such a great sense. I'll tell you a quick story before we go. On that Leinster tour to Romania. And the conditions were awful. It was just before the fall of Ceausescu. So you had to bribe a waiter to get an extra egg at breakfast, and the conditions were bad. But we had people like Freddie McLennan and Paul McNaughton and Hugo McNeil. And the fun we had was, can you believe we used to play charades at Leinster rugby team? That fun, but it it was more competitive, and you slagged the people if they got it wrong. But we had a fabulous, fabulous time. And it was coming to the end, and we were invited as a special treat. It was like a big treat to sail up the Danube and to go to this amazing castle, which was renowned for its cuisine. And we were all starving. I mean, guys like Philip Orr, you know, huge, big guys, George Wallace. We hadn't had proper food now for 2 weeks. So we're on this cruise going up to this castle, looking forward to this great meal. So McNaughton and McLennan are going around with a list, and they said, you have a choice between the chicken and the steak, but whatever you choose now, you have to have. That's just the way it is. So guys were debating, you know, how many pieces of chicken is it going to be? Is it going to be what sort of steak? How many, you know, whatever. Everyone made their plans, and we arrived up at this great castle into this banqueting room, and in front of us, with a great, you know, sort of ceremonial gesture, they placed this bowl of greasy water with this fish's head looking up out of it. And this was our meal, which was some local thing. And we all looked around, where the fuck am I? And there's lying in the corner, collapsed laughing. You know, the whole thing was set up. And that was the sort of thing McNaughton could do, you know, and Freddie, who now lives in Cape Town. And just thinking about the old cliche, Jeremy, you know, you more think of the personalities and the things than the actual games. But that was lovely. And you know, I follow Greystones still, and I'd love to see them getting up through the ranks and getting more players in. And, you know, it's great to be a social club, a rugby club with a social side involved. But I think if you're a social club with a rugby team involved, and I'm not suggesting that's what's happening to Greystones, but I think it's a real danger. In the time when Greystones, always the rugby was first, and there was that dream of becoming a senior club, and there was that dream of becoming a good senior club and playing great rugby, and everything else that was beside it, all the wonderful things and fun social things that happened, they were always second to the rugby. And that's why I loved it so much and still do.
John, can't thank you enough for coming on today. Having left Greystones in 1981, everybody that's come since, Spud Murphy, Nick Popplewell, Reggie Corrigan, you know, through to the more recent players, Owen O'Brien, John O'Byrne, Neil McGannady, Andrew Keeley, all of us, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and there's not many. No, it shouldn't be. I mean, you put Greystones on the map, John, and like on behalf of the club, it's been just so great to talk to you. And I just can't think of a better way to have finished up season 2 of the podcast than to have you on. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely fantastic. And we'll speak again soon, I'm sure.
Jeremy, it's been a great honour, and everything the best. And to all my mates at Greystones, and to my 98-year-old mum, who still lives in Greystones on her own. I love you all.
Thanks so much, John. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks very much, Jeremy. Well done, eh?